Kofi Mensah was 41 years old, a structural engineer who had spent 14 years reading blueprints the way other men read faces, for the thing the lines weren't quite saying. He drove a gray Hilux with a cracked dashboard mount that he'd been meaning to fix for 3 years. He kept a folded site plan in the left chest pocket of his work jacket every morning, without fail. He came home on a Tuesday afternoon in February to find the house exactly as he had left it, quiet, orderly, every surface in its place, except that his wife was standing in the living room with a printed bank statement in her hand and something prepared behind her eyes. She had, it turned out, already spent $4.2 million of the inheritance his father had left him 11 months ago. She had done this quietly, over the course of 4 separate transactions, while he was managing a commercial project 3 states away. She had timed it to land when he would be least positioned to notice. She had not, however, timed it to land after he had already moved the money. Before we go any further, drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. The morning light was still flat and silver when Kofi arrived at the site office that week, the same way it had been flat the day his father called him from the hospital, the same way it would be flat, he already knew, for weeks to come. Kofi had spent 14 years building the kind of professional name that traveled ahead of him, not because he had chased the reputation, because he had delivered the work, every time, for every client who hired him, without exception. His crew knew him by the folded plan in his breast pocket, and by the fact that if Kofi said Wednesday, the delivery was there by Tuesday evening. He drove the Hilux because it could handle any site, in any condition, without complaint. The cab smelled like cement dust and black coffee from a thermos he refilled each morning at 5:30, before anyone else arrived. He wore the same steel toe boots for 4 years and replaced them only when the sole began to separate at the heel. He was not, by nature, a man who held on to things. Not bitterness. Not old arguments. Not money, though he was careful with it in the way a man is careful with something he understands. When his father passed in March of the previous year, the inheritance had been straightforward. Batura Mensah had been a man of structure too. He had left documents in order, a registered property, and $5.7 million in a fixed account. He had divided it cleanly. Kofi had received $2 million and the title to a small commercial plot in Abuja. He had told Adeze about the money the week it transferred. He had not told her he had already moved it. He had no reason to suspect she was already counting it as hers. Then came the Tuesday in February. And everything that followed came from there. The room was warm when she spoke. The ceiling fan was turning in slow, useless circles. Kofi had his sight bag over one shoulder and his thermos in his left hand. He was still in the boots. Adeze was already standing when he came through the door. The printed statement was in her right hand, held slightly out from her body, not offered to him, not pointed at him, just present. She had chosen that position deliberately, he registered, the way someone chooses where to stand in a negotiation. She was wearing the green dress she wore when she wanted to be taken seriously. He noticed this the way he noticed everything on a job site, without announcement, without conclusion. "I need us to talk," she said. The line arrived too smoothly. She had been working up to it for hours, maybe days. Kofi set his bag on the floor beside the door. He did not move toward her. He said nothing. "Your father's inheritance." She held the statement a fraction of an inch higher. "I made some decisions while you were away. I want to be honest with you about it." He looked at the statement. He looked at her. He did not ask what decisions. He did not reach for the paper. He did not raise his voice or take a step toward her. He stood in the space between the door and the room and let the silence fill the place where a reaction would have been. I needed to settle the loan on the boutique, she said. The interest was compounding. I used 1.9 million. I handled it. She paused. And there was the land matter in Port Harcourt. My uncle has been dealing with that for years. I covered 2.3 million so we could close it before the court date. I was going to tell you. He looked at the total at the bottom of the statement for 3 seconds. Then he looked at her face. Somewhere in what she had just said, a name had appeared. A name attached to the Port Harcourt land matter. He had heard that name once before, in a passing phone call she had taken in the kitchen 6 months ago. A call she had not mentioned afterward. He had not asked about it. He had noted it, quietly, the way he noted a stress fracture in a load-bearing wall, without alarm, without immediate action. He had filed it away. I know this is a lot to process, she said. I'm sorry you're having to hear it like this. He picked up his bag from the floor. He walked past her to the bedroom. He needed the road. He needed to be in the Hilux, with the site plan in his pocket and the thermos in the cup holder, moving through air that hadn't been rehearsed. He would figure out the rest when his mind was level. He drove for 40 minutes without deciding where he was going. 2 years before any of this, Kofi had taken 3 weeks of personal leave, unpaid, because the project timeline didn't allow for anything longer, to help Daisy register her boutique with the Corporate Affairs Commission, resolve a lease dispute with her landlord, and reconstruct 18 months of inventory records that had been lost when her assistant quit without notice. He had done this at the kitchen table, after 10-hour site days, because she had asked him to, and because she needed someone who could read a legal document without panic. She had received his help the way she received most things he did, as background, as something that had simply been handled. She had thanked him once, briefly, and moved on to talking about fabric suppliers. He had noticed, around that same time, a change in the texture of her attention when they were together. Not dramatic, a frequency shift. She was present in the ways she had always been present, but something beneath that presence had turned slightly away. He had chosen to interpret it as stress. She was building something. Building was hard. He had extended that interpretation for 14 months because he believed in what they had built together and because he was a man who did not call a structure compromised without checking the foundations first. His site manager, a man named Emeka, who had worked beside him for 8 years, had said something once after watching Kofi resolve a 3-way contractor dispute without raising his voice. He had said, "The thing about you is that you never let anyone see the calculation happening. They only see the decision." He'd said it as a compliment. Kofi hadn't held on to it at the time. That was the thing she had never found worth knowing. Her name was Ngozi Adeleke. She was 63 years old, a retired paralegal who had spent 27 years working with a civil litigation firm in Lagos before moving back to Abuja to be near her daughter. She had lived 3 houses down from Kofi and Adeyeze for 4 years. She had watched, from a position of quiet professional attention, what had been happening to the left of her front window. She had not spoken to Kofi about it for the same reason she had never spoken prematurely on a case file. She had been waiting for him to be in a position to receive what she had kept. She called him on the Thursday, 2 days after the Tuesday. He was sitting in the site office. He picked up. "Come for tea," she said. "I'm going to show you something." He arrived at 7 in the evening. The living room was small and ordered. A wooden table. A folder, closed, at the center of it. She placed a cup of tea in front of him before she sat down. "I'm going to lay this out in sequence," she said. "I need you to let me get through all of it before you respond." He nodded once. Ngozi opened the folder. The first record was dated the previous September, 7 months before the Tuesday conversation. A photograph taken from her car window a daisy, leaving a property registration office in Maitama. The man beside her was signing something at a desk visible through the glass. His name appeared on the second document Ngozi placed on the table. It was the same name Kofi had heard in the kitchen phone call 6 months ago. He looked at it for a moment. He said nothing. The records continued. A printed WhatsApp log. Ngozi's niece had worked at the boutique part-time and had kept records of what she'd observed and been asked not to mention. The pattern across 4 months was specific. Dates, amounts discussed, a name that appeared alongside every decision Adaize had told Kofi she was handling independently. "There's more," Ngozi said. She pulled a second document from the folder's back sleeve. The land matter in Port Harcourt. She placed it on the table. The plot does not belong to her uncle. It was registered 4 months ago to an LLC co-signed by the same man. The $3 million transferred directly into that LLC's account. What she told you the land matter was for, that is not what the land matter was. Kofi was quiet for a specific count of 5 seconds. He set his cup down. He looked at the wall in front of him for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "What's the name on the LLC?" "Kidozi Aram. He's the director. She is listed as a silent partner." "Since when?" "The registration date is the 14th of October. He processed this with the same attention he brought to a materials discrepancy on a project. Not with feeling, not yet, with a checklist. One item confirmed, then the next. He asked 3 more questions. Ngozi answered each one from the folder. Then he stood from the table and walked around to stand behind it, looking at everything spread across the surface. He approached it the way he approached a project layout, not one document at a time, but from above. Seeing the full structure at once. He could see how each line connected to the next. Where the money had moved. Which decisions had been made first, which had followed from which, and how long the sequencing had taken to construct. He could see it the way he saw a structural plan, not as separate components, but as one coordinated load-bearing system. He understood it completely. He thanked Ngozi. He took nothing from the table. She had copies of everything. He drove back to the site office and called his attorney. He didn't act immediately. Emeka Obi, Kofi's attorney, had already begun pulling records before the call ended. He had started the previous morning, at 6:08 a.m. Because the person who had called him the night before and described the situation was someone Emeka had known for 11 years, and whose read of a situation he had never found to be mistaken. By the time Kofi sat across from him that Friday, Emeka had already found the first discrepancy, a signature on the boutique's original loan document that had been used to authorize a secondary guarantee against a property whose title still carried Kofi's name. The authorization had been filed on a Wednesday when Kofi was on site in Kaduna. Emeka had the filing date. He had the notarized stamp. He had the identity of the notary. Kofi had retained a forensic accountant named Chiamaka Eze by the following Tuesday. She was small, composed, and worked through financial records the way Kofi worked through structural plans, with a systematic patience that was entirely free of drama. What she surfaced in the first week was more complete than Kofi had anticipated. The boutique loan had not been in distress. The interest had not been compounding. Both claims had been invented retroactively to account for the transfer. The actual state of the boutique's accounts, which Chiamaka had obtained through the proper channels, showed a balance that had been growing steadily. The $1.9 million had not gone toward any business debt. It had gone in 2 installments to the same account that had received the Port Harcourt transfer. Total, $4.2 million. 3 transactions. one name on the receiving end of all of them. Adaize called on a Wednesday afternoon. Kofi let it go to voicemail. She called again the following morning. He listened to both messages that evening, once in the site office. The first message was composed, warm in places, strategic. She wanted to talk through everything properly. She was sure they could resolve it. The second message had changed register. The warmth was still present, but thinner. An edge had appeared at the margins of it. She mentioned that people had apparently been giving him ideas. She mentioned her own attorney. He noted the shift in tone the same way he would note a change in curing time on a pore. Not emotionally, just carefully. He called her on a Friday morning. His voice was level and collaborative. He told her he thought they could handle this without a courtroom. He suggested a meeting the following week, all parties together, to go through the terms and arrive at a resolution. She agreed before he had finished the sentence. He could hear the shape of her relief even through the restraint she was applying to it. He ended the call. Emeka was across the desk from him. "She thinks it's already settled," Kofi said. Emeka said nothing. He refilled his own coffee. Kofi reached the building 22 minutes before anyone was expected. He preferred it that way. The conference room was on the 4th floor of a firm on Aguiyi Ironsi Street. A long table, flat lighting, a window looking out over the city in the early morning quiet. No history in the room. A place where things were completed, not performed. Emeka arrived at 8, followed by Chiamaka. They took one side of the table. Documents organized in 3 labeled folders. The room held a particular kind of stillness. The stillness of people who had already done the work and were not nervous about what they had brought. Adaize arrived at 8:19 with her attorney. She entered with the bearing of someone who had decided the shape of the conversation before sitting down. She looked at Kofi once, a brief professional acknowledgement, and then turned her attention to Emeka, as if Kofi were simply another party to proceedings she intended to manage. The man beside her had the measured ease of someone who had reviewed a situation and found it manageable. Emeka addressed the room. Before any discussion of terms, there are several matters this session needs to acknowledge. I'd prefer to get through them without interruption. We'll allow time for response at the appropriate point. He opened the first folder and began setting documents on the table with the unhurried pace of someone who had done this before and had no reason to be in a hurry about it. This is the guarantee instrument signed against the property registered under Mr. Mensah's name, executed on the 14th of November. The signature was authorized using a limited power of attorney that was issued for the purpose of utility management during Mr. Mensah's extended absence on a commercial project. The guarantee it was used to execute falls outside the scope of that authorization. A civil action has been filed in connection with this instrument. The figure involved is 4.2 million. He set the page flat on the table and allowed a moment before moving forward. Chiamaka placed the second folder on the table. Emeka walked through it without editorializing. 3 transfers. 2 installments on the 14th of October totaling 3 million, and 2 installments on the 2nd of January totaling 1.9 million. Destination: a current account under the name of Aram and Partners Limited. The director of record is Kidozi Aram. The silent partner listed at registration is Adaize Mensah. The company was registered on the 14th of October, 11 days before the first transfer from the inheritance account. Adaize had not allowed her expression to change. But the effort required to hold it exactly where it was had become visible, to anyone looking closely enough, in the way she was holding the muscles around her jaw. Kofi was looking closely. The attorney beside her shifted his weight in the chair. The ease he had carried into the room had left his expression. "The third item," Emeka said, "is the transfer history from the boutique's operational account. which establishes that the business was not in arrears at any point during the period in which the transfers occurred. The characterization of the $1.9 million as debt repayment is not supported by the record. He closed the folder. We are not making representations about criminal exposure in this room today. What we are establishing is that this documentation exists, that it is preserved in its complete form, and that it will be part of any proceeding going forward. Adesi's attorney looked up from the page he had been reading. His expression had come to a full stop. The room was quiet for 9 seconds. Kofi counted them. "We'll allow time for your review," Emeka said. "We can schedule the follow-up before the end of the week." Kofi stood. He took nothing from the table. He had brought one folder, and its purpose had been served. He buttoned the top button of his jacket. He shook Emeka's hand. He walked to the door. He stopped. He turned. He looked at Adese directly, not loudly, not for the room, for her specifically, because it was meant for her and not for anyone else in it. "You moved it like it was already yours," he said. "The record says otherwise." He walked out. He did not look back. It didn't compress into a single week. The LC began unwinding almost immediately, not dramatically, but with the particular constancy of something that can't be set down once it's been picked up. The co-signer had his own legal situation to manage by the end of March, which narrowed the options available to everyone connected to the instrument. Adesi's attorney filed a counter-response that required 2 amendments before it could be properly submitted. The boutique's lease came up for renewal in April, and the landlord, who had heard the name Mensa for 4 years in connection with the space and now heard it differently, declined to extend without a new guarantor. She was carrying what she had decided to carry. Not loudly, just constantly. Kofi was building something. Without urgency, the same way he built everything. His name was on a new contract by the end of February, a mixed-use development in Abuja, the largest scope he had managed independently. He had 9 people on the structural team, a 10th starting in June. He returned every message the same afternoon. He gave timelines, and he met them. 14 months after the conference room, Kofi's firm occupied the 2nd floor of a small commercial building on the edge of Wuse, Zone 2. 4 offices, a meeting room, a common area where the team gathered at the end of site days to go over what had gone right and what needed correcting. His name was on the front door in modest navy lettering, Mensa Structural Partners. He had framed the first signed contract of the new firm. It hung on the interior wall of his office, level, in a plain black frame. He had hung it himself, with a torpedo level, the morning the furniture arrived. On a late October evening, Kofi sat on the back terrace of a house he had rented near the Jabi Lake. The neighborhood was running through its usual end-of-day rhythms, a generator cycling on somewhere to the left, children finishing something in a compound across the road, the call to prayer beginning its descent from the minaret he could see above the tree line. He finished his coffee. He brought the cup inside. He turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dark before going upstairs. His name was on the plans for the next 3 projects. He had already started reading them,